when we're talking about the marginal productivity of capital and the income share that goes to capital or labor, the principle that we're working with is the profit maximizing principle of the representative firm under a perfectly competitive set of conditions, in which case each firm will hire additional units of labor until the marginal productivity of labor is equal to the wage rate. You're not going to hire somebody and pay them more than the marginal revenue product of their labor, what they're contributing towards your enterprise. That's really hard to identify, though, isn't it? So if I mow a lawn and I'm using a lawnmower to do it, what part of the lawn did I mow? What part of the lawn did the lawnmower mow? Let's treat this as if we're talking about the days before robotic lawnmowers. Well, how could you test? Well, you can put me out there without the lawnmower and see how much of it gets done. Or you could put the lawnmower out there without me and see how much of it gets done. And the marginal productivity of capital and labor, right, it's hard to measure in that sense. You have to have a competitive environment in order to get even a measure of at the margin, what the marginal productivity of an additional unit of capital or labor would be. You can have more and more capital with the same amount of labor, and it can make it more productive up to a point. But at a certain point, there's hardly any gains. You've got a pizza shop, and you've got 5 guys working in the pizza shop, and if you have 2 ovens, you can make a certain amount of pizzas. If you keep adding ovens, if you got 10 ovens, you're not going to get that much more productivity out of those 5 employees at a certain point. It's just not even going to make a difference. So we want to be thinking about where this works at the margin. In general, what we've discovered empirically as economists is that the share of output or of income that goes to capital tends to be roughly 30%. And the share that goes to labor tends to be closer to 70%. So if GDP is $20 trillion, then we expect what? That roughly 6 trillion, I guess, is going to capital, and the other 14 trillion is going to wages, to labor. Does that make sense to you? Okay. The other thing that we do when we break down our understanding of the market is we use this equation to express sort of all the components that are involved in GDP as they are collected by the statisticians. And so we've got consumption, investment, government services, and net exports. And it may be interesting to you to know that consumption accounts for 68% of GDP, investment accounts for about 17% of GDP, government accounts for about 17% of GDP, and exports accounts for negative 3% of GDP. How can something count for less than something? Well, this just is indicating that imports are greater than exports for the United States. That has to show up somewhere else, though, doesn't it? It has to show up in the capital account balances. So it's showing it back up somewhere else in the market, or in the economy. Important to note, right, that of the government services that are accounted for in GDP, only about 1/3 of that is federal. The other 2/3 are state and local. So we complain sometimes that the government is so big, and when we typically say that, we're talking about the federal government, and maybe the federal government is too big. That's a conversation for us to have. But state and local government is actually 2/3 of that, which is a lot. And what does that count for? That's, it doesn't make sense. Most of what the federal government does is not actually providing goods or services, is it? They buy guns and tanks and such for the military. What else does the federal government buy? Rent in Washington, D.C., that's expensive. Trust me, I live there. What else does the federal government buy? Not a whole lot of other things. They fund the Transportation Safety Administration and other large agencies like that. Most of that's going to hiring people. Most of it's payroll, as with any other enterprise. But otherwise, the vast majority of the things that government does is just transfer. It's taxing Peter to pay Paul. Most of what the federal government does is take money from some people and give it to other people. And that isn't accounted for in the calculations of GDP. So that share of government activity isn't captured in this. The other 2/3 of state of government activity is state and local activity. Now that makes some sense. Why? Because what do we fund at the state and local level? Schools, fire departments, police departments, public hospitals, universities. What else? Roads, infrastructure. All that stuff comes primarily at the state and local level. There are sometimes grants that come through the federal government, but again, that's sort of a transfer from some populaces to other populaces. What should we take away from all of that? Maybe that if there's a level at which to be engaged in civic conversation, start at the local level and then work your way up, right? So I was on a video conference last week, having to do with county council elections. And I brought up the thing about the body scanners again, and was chatting about that. The idea was that the sheriff's department in Muncie wanted to buy a full body scanner to put in the public building downtown. And I claimed that the sheriff's department went and asked for this body scanner, $160,000 body scanner, and that the council approved it without checking it at all. Well, guess who showed up in the same chat? The sheriff. The county sheriff showed up in the same chat, and correct me, first of all, it wasn't the council that they had asked the money for, it was the commissioners. I didn't even know there were two separate things. And I'm supposed to know a lot about government. It wasn't $160,000, it was $139,000. It didn't come out of county taxes, it came out of federal taxes. It was a grant from the CARES Act, to all of which I responded to. Still, did you inform the commissioners what the second best option was and what the additional benefit of having the best one was expected to be relative to the second best option? And they said, no, we asked for the top of the line item, especially since it was being paid for by the CARES Act. I said, well, turns out that I also pay federal taxes, not just county taxes. So that bothers me that you treat that money so cavalierly. It's still my money. It still has an opportunity cost to be used for something else. Just because you're receiving a federal grant for something doesn't mean that it's the best use of that money. It could have gone to something else. And the other thing I said was, you didn't even check what the next best option was. What if the next best option was $80,000 instead of $139,000, and it's just as good? Or you catch one less bad guy every 10 years. Is that really worthwhile? And then finally, what if every single county agency, whenever they made a requisition to the county commissioners or the council, whichever, always asked for the top of the line item and never presented the second best option as an alternative and demonstrated what the opportunity costs were for choosing? Should every single agency do that? Of course not. Of course not. No, I won't be running for office. Okay. Interesting to think about these details. We've been building a model. And again, why so much algebra in the model? You did a lot of graph type stuff in your intro macro course. Why so much algebra in the intermediate level course? And the goal, of course, is to get to something like this. This is a simple linear regression equation that gets used in statistical software to run regressions and find the lines of best fit so that we can weigh the relative importance of different factors. We've got an intercept and different variables that are independent variables that are affecting independent variables. In macroeconomics, what we want to do is build a model that we can then apply to real-world data and see if the model fits the data. And so you've got to put it into algebra in order to be able to do this. One of the things that you're going to want to be able to do is to run a regression model on some data in order to indicate to your clients, whoever they might be, the relative importance of different factors in their operations. Let's continue to build the model. Let's look at the goods market. Who's going to buy? Who will buy this glorious morning? In our model, we're dealing with what we were going to call a closed economy, which means that we're not considering imports and exports. We're treating our economy as if there were no foreign trade going on, that all things produced in the United States are bought in the United States. And so then we've got consumption, we've got demand for consumer goods. To build our aggregate demand kind of model, we've got consumption, investment, and government spending. So for consumption, we want to treat consumption as our disposable income. What do we actually consume? Our disposable is equal to our income minus what we have to pay in taxes. Just looking at that small model so far, what can we say about our disposable income and consumption? If our total disposable income, this whole right-hand side increases, then our consumption also increases. What can we say if taxes go up? If taxes go up, that means that our disposable income goes down and our consumption goes down. What if total productivity in the world goes up? What if Y goes up? Well, then our disposable income goes up and consumption goes up. This way of modeling or of talking through the story of what happens with a model is really common in macro. I could use partial derivative terms to indicate all this and put signs on the partials, but this is more straightforward and doesn't involve as heavy use of mathematician. We looked last time at the marginal propensity to consume. We built a model related to consumption that looks something like this. And what was this intercept again? Can you recall what that intercept indicated? Yes?
The least amount to live on.
Yeah, the least amount to live on. Sort of a C0 kind of a term. We just think y equals mx plus b graph models, right? We have our consumption is equal to C0 plus C1 y minus t. We've got an intercept and then a slope. Actually, this should be marginal propensity to consume times y minus t. In other words, the slope of this line is our marginal propensity to consume. This bothers me. Does it bother you at all? I mean, if there is a minimum level of consumption, there's a presumption that people can't get dead. But they can. And it does happen. And where does the money to consume that much come from if it hasn't been earned? Out of thin air? I'm confused. This bothers me. And I think that it sneaks in a normative idea that everybody will at least be provided a minimum level of consumption. Maybe that's true, but it seems to be a normative element snuck in. Okay. And what I said about this model that was interesting is that there's no R involved. There's no interest rate involved. The model that we're about to build is all about R. To get a little bit of background on R, it's helpful to be informed about the Fisher equation, which is that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. The real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Okay. The next question we have to ask ourselves is, what does the investment function look like? And as far as the model that we're working on, the total amount of loanable funds that are invested is a function of the interest rate. Which is to say that the lower the interest rate, the more projects are going to be entered into by entrepreneurs. The larger the number of projects are worthwhile to undertake. The higher the interest rate, the fewer the number of projects are going to be worth investing in. And so we get a downward sloping investment function in terms of the interest rate. To put it in this way of talking about things, if the interest rate goes up, then the level of investment goes down. Again, in this story, investment is strictly from the borrower's point of view so far. Moving forward, we're going to hold government spending exogenous. We're going to say that government spending is exogenously set, or in other words, is flat, isn't changing. If I were to assert that G is equal to T, what am I implying? G is government spending, T is taxes. If government spending is equal to taxes, what does that imply?
Income is all taxes.
Not quite, no. All of government income comes from taxes. Or all the money that the government spends comes from taxes. In other words, yes, we have a balanced budget. Do we currently have a balanced budget? Have we ever? Yeah, actually. Different times in the past, there has been a balanced budget. What would a balanced budget amendment requiring the government to run a balanced budget imply for the overall economy? It would imply that it can't run deficits during recessions, which might mean that the government has fewer tools available to respond to a recession or to try to get us out of a recession, if government action actually can get us out of a recession. If. Doesn't say as much about monetary policy. A balanced budget would destroy any kind of activity on the fiscal policy side, that which is done by Congress. It wouldn't necessarily hinder the activities of the Federal Reserve. The responding to crises. We can build a bigger model of aggregate demand. By putting together all the other pieces. We can say that aggregate demand or output is equal to consumption in terms of disposable income plus investment as expressed in terms of the interest rate plus government spending. And what we're going to do to play with this model and look at how different things interact is we're simply going to apply the ceteris paribus assumption. Which will hold several variables constant and leave only one to vary. So we're going to hold government spending constant. We're going to hold overall economic output constant, and we're going to hold taxes constant, which only really leaves the interest rate to fluctuate. So that's what your chapter is doing here, is it is investigating how the interest rate could be the vehicle whereby the overall macroeconomy is brought into an equilibrium. Is it usually the vehicle for doing that? Sometimes. We hear an awful lot about the Federal Reserve toying with interest rates, trying to manipulate them. The Federal Reserve can't set an interest rate, by the way. We often hear that in the news, but the Federal Reserve doesn't set an interest rate, it sets a target. And tries to engage in all different kinds of operations, including open market operations and purchasing and selling of assets so as to arrive at that prevailing interest rate in the marketplace. But it doesn't set it, it doesn't decree it from above. This is our aggregate demand. Our aggregate supply, we always want a supply to go with our demand. Our model for that is simply our production function, in which we have established capital and labor as being the inputs into production. Now, the aggregate supply curve, as far as we've described it thus far, is treated as inelastic. So we can set this, which is this, equal to this, and we get our overall model for the economy. What we're looking into here really is the loanable funds market. With the interest rate being the time price of money that can freely fluctuate so as to allow the market to clear. To demand loanable funds is to invest. To supply loanable funds is savings. And then P, the price, is the real interest rate. R. Again, investors demand loanable funds. Why? To buy equipment so that they can make stuff. That's involved in what we call the roundabout process of growth or production. We purchase capital that helps make us, that further augments our labor, that allows us to be more productive and make more stuff. That depends negatively on the interest rate. Savings, we can think about that as being different kinds of savings. We can save our money in the bank. We can save our money in other kinds of financial institutions. In a way that we can think about savings actually as lending. Because that's where the money usually ends up. Unless it's under your mattress, money that you save ends up being loaned out to somebody else who's going to use it to buy capital. Private savings can be broken up into two different categories: savings done by private entities and savings done by the government. Private savings is simply your disposable income minus what you actually consume. For this area. Whatever you don't actually consume is what gets saved. Public savings, government savings, public savings, is equal to the tax revenue the government brings in minus whatever it spends. Again, we've assumed that sometimes it can be a balanced budget, but if the government brings in more in terms of revenue than what it actually spends, then they can pay down the federal debt, and as a result, functionally save. It works out to be savings. Okay. Put the two together, you get y minus t minus c plus t minus g. That looks really familiar, doesn't it? It's really similar to that. If we look at this more closely, if we were to distribute everything, we'd have y minus t minus c plus t minus g. You notice you got a minus t and a plus t, so those two cancel. You're left with y minus c minus g. In other words, total output minus that which gets consumed by consumers and that which is consumed by the government. All of that is what ends up getting saved. Income minus what gets spent. This is what's going to determine savings. If I were to expand this, what would we see? We'd see that savings is equal to output minus consumption minus government spending, which is equal to the interest rate. But in this model, what we've done is we have set output constant, taxes constant, and government constant. So within this term, what varies? Consumption is just a function of these two things. So nothing is varying. In other words, savings is a straight line. It's perfectly in a line. So then, what is the interest rate that will bring demand and supply into equilibrium? X marks the spot. The correct interest rate will bring the market into equilibrium. We can include S here as being one of the terms that is on the x-axis. Because we're talking both about investment and savings and coming to some sort of equilibrium in the market for loanable funds, which involves both borrowers and lenders. This is a helpful thing to remember, that it's investment and savings, because we're building something called the ISLM model, which you may have seen as the chapter title for some of the later chapters in your textbook. This is the IS piece. That's right, you've got it. So the thing we want to do with our model is to toy with it, to adjust it. we begin by asking a simple question like, what happens if the government spends more? What happens if there's a change in government spending? So if government spending increases, how will that affect the elements in our model? If the model has to come back to equilibrium and the government spends more, the model has to return to equilibrium, how will it do that? If we reframe this and put y back on the left-hand side, we would say that output is equal to c plus I plus g. If government goes up and output is constant and taxes are constant and output is constant, then the only thing that is available to change is the interest rate. The interest rate has to fall. How does that work? If the government is spending more, but taxes are the same, then the government is running a deficit and is saving. That functions as if it were a leftward shift in the supply curve for loanable funds, which results in a higher interest rate. So investment goes down, but remember that if investment goes down, the interest rate goes up. The quantity of investment goes down. The interest rate goes up. You follow the machine? However poorly I'm guiding you through it. What if there is instead a decrease in tax revenues? How would that flow through this machine? If there's a decrease in taxes, that means that the overall level of consumption will increase. If consumption increases, then that will lead to, in terms of the marginal propensity to consume, people wanting to consume more and save less, which pushes the investment rate down, and that would push the interest rate up. Okay. Do you believe this? You believe that the savings rate is perfectly inelastic? If the interest rate goes up, wouldn't you be expected to put more money into savings? You've got $10 now. The higher the interest rate, the more you get back at some point in time in the future. So we think that really and truly, savings does respond. Savings does respond to the interest rate. But again, in the simplified model, we've pushed that to the side. The main thing I think that you take away from this chapter is familiarity with the variables and what we call them, so that we can go the next step and start to play with them and learn a little bit more about them. One way that we can do this is to work through one of the practice problems from the textbook. For example, the second question at the end of the chapter says, suppose that the production function in medieval Europe is y equals k.5 L.5. So what we're going to do now is apply a specific algebraic form to the production function and say that y is equal to k to the 0.5 of L to the 0.5. The economy begins with 100 units of land and 100 units of labor. So how much capital is there in the world? 100 units. How much labor is there? 100 units. What would our total level of output be if that were the case? Can you calculate it? Y equals 100.5 times 100.5. 100 to the 0.5 is 10. So basically the square root times 10, again the square root. So y is equal to 100. Total output is 100 units. Of what? Of GDP. Of whatever it is we're talking about. What is the wage in this story? How did we calculate the wage before? We said that the wage was 1 minus alpha times total output. Do you remember that? If alpha is 0.5, then 1 minus alpha is 0.5. If output is 100, then the wage to labor is 50. Similarly, the interest to capital is alpha times total output, again 0.5 times 100, again 50. Half of the wages are going to capital, half of the wages are going to labor. That's what these 0.5s really mean. If a plague kills half of the population, what is the new level of output? That's grim. Bring out your dead. Bring out your dead if a plague kills half of our workers. What do we have? Well, then we have K equals 100 and L equals 50. Plug those back into our equation. What's our total level of output? Y equals 100 times 0.5. Yep. Times 50. 0.5. Y is equal to 10. What's the square root of 50? 7 point something. Right? Let's call 7.1 for the sake of the argument. Okay. And what's our total level of output? It's going to be close to 71. What is the wage? And what is the interest rate? Again, wage is 1 minus alpha times y. It would be 0.5 times 71. And similarly, the wage is this, and capital is actually going to be the same thing, isn't it? Check my notes here. Labor will now be receiving 35 units of output, and capital will also be receiving 35 units of output. Give or take, adding up to 71. Now here's the puzzle. What about the individual worker? Because here we had to take that 50 units and divide it by 100 workers, didn't we? So each worker got half a unit. How much does each worker get now? there's 50 people, and you divide that by, you divide 35 by 50, and that'll give you the income to the individual worker. So each individual worker gets more, don't they, than they did before. What about the owners of capital? How are they affected by the death of half of the population? Well, they've got 35 divided by 100, right, which is 0.35, which is less than, whatever this is greater than half. So 35 divided by 0.7, isn't it? So the wage has gone up while the return to capital has gone down. Does that make sense? Intuitively, does that make sense to you? Why? Because each individual worker will have more capital at their disposal to augment their labor than they had before. If before half of the workers had shovels, the other half had rakes, now each worker has a shovel and a rake. Are they able to do just as much work as before? No. But each individual one of them is able to do more work than each of them was able to do before because they have higher access to capital as an individual. You have to work through the problem and then seek out the intuition in order to really grasp the concept. So one consequence of the plague in Europe was that the owners of capital, in particular the nobility that owned all the land, who owned all the tools, started receiving a lower share of the income, or a lower absolute amount of income per unit of capital, while the individual workers started receiving higher returns to labor, which changed the power balance between the lords and ladies and the peasants in favor of the peasants. In a way, we maybe could never have gotten the Industrial Revolution without first having had the plague. If we look at problem number 10, here's another example. Consider an economy described as output is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending. Output is 8,000 units. Government takes 2,500 units. Taxes are 2,000 units. Consumption is equal to 1,000 units plus 2/3 of output minus taxes. And investment is equal to 1,200 minus 100 R. In this economy, compute private savings, public savings, and national savings. So, what would private savings be? Private savings is equal to Y minus T. Private savings is equal to disposable income minus what gets consumed. Isn't that right? Or more simply, private savings is equal to total output minus taxes minus consumption. So total output is 8,000. So we have 8,000 minus taxes is 2,000 minus, we've got a minimum level of consumption that we've got to meet. So it's 1,000 minus 2/3 of the difference between output and taxation. So you get 6,000 here minus 1,000. 8,000 minus 2,000 is 6,000. 2/3 of that would be 4,000 minus 4,000. 1,000 minus 4,000 is, I'm sure I got the math right here. It should be plus 2/3, my mistake. Plus 4,000. 6,000 minus 5,000 is 1,000. So that's how much private savings would be. What about government savings? Or public savings? Public savings is the amount of taxes the government has left over after it makes its purchases. So you take taxes minus government spending, and that is public savings. So 2,000 minus 2,500 is negative 500. So then overall, in this economy, private and public savings, or in other words, national savings, is equal to 500 units. If this is the total amount that gets saved, and we have to have the economy come to balance and equilibrate and clear, then this has to be the same amount that gets invested. Savings and investment have to be equal to each other. So then I can take that 500, set it equal to 1,200 minus 100R, and solve. So I get 700 equals 100R, where R equals 7%. You see how this starts to make some sense? What we've just done is we've identified, notice, this is a function that starts at 1,200 and has a slope of negative 100, so it's down 100 for every one it goes over. And we found that given 500 as our savings rate, it comes to an equilibrium at an interest rate of 7. On your own, I recommend working through some more of these problems to try to gain more intuition into how to model this function.